Hi, welcome to another podcast from Ian Wallace. An interesting podcast, hopefully, today for you. The Messed Up Counsellor. Aren't we all dysfunctional? I believe so. So, today I want to look at loss and how it kind of can bring on other complicated feelings and emotions other than just loss. And loss in the wider context, not loss just as somebody passing over, somebody dying, but maybe loss of job, loss of relationship, loss of power, even. When I work with loss, it's kind of probably loss and rejection are the two biggest things that human beings have to cope with. And they're the things that most of us are not necessarily good at doing, certainly rejection. And that process of loss, we can start by working with something whereby maybe somebody's died, a family member, a friend, a relationship partner. And as we work with that, we can then start finding that it raises other complicated emotions. Now, loss is complicated enough, but we can kind of get a sense that other losses that we've incurred in our life, which I said doesn't have to be somebody dying, it can be a loss of a job or a loss of a relationship, can bring forward these other aspects, complicated trauma, as they sometimes call it nowadays. These sometimes come out of the blue. They were actually part and parcel of the process of what we're working on. And when we're working with that, it's really hard sometimes to separate the situation scenario that we're going through now and these other aspects, because there are so many similarities within feelings and emotions. So when we go through a change, an alteration, then it starts becoming awkward to sometimes look at these other things. I'll give you an example of that. Way before I started being a counsellor, I was in corporate world, and they were looking to get rid of some people, save money. So they were trying to do it by not necessarily giving me a package. They were trying to do it by basically getting rid of me for something they say I had done. And I won't go into details and bore you with it. But at the end of the day, that couldn't happen. So they made it very hard for me to go into work. Awkward. So as I'm going through this process and experience those process of loss, those aspects, which initially, usually it's denial, it ain't happening, which is why sometimes you find people that have lost their job still go and to work, in a sense, go out the house at the same time in the morning, take their pack up, take their sandwiches, wear work clothes, all these kind of things, and they just go out and have a day out somewhere and then come back as though they've been to work. And that can be quite strange sometimes. So as we're going through that process of ending of that job, that role, that function, I found that initially there was this anger, frustration. And I found that the anger and frustration wasn't always just about what I was going through. I was getting angry with all sorts of things. And none of it basically connected to the role, the job, the function. But other people around me were experiencing some of that anger. Now, looking back as a counsellor with reflection and the kind of processes we do, then I kind of realised that some of the feelings and emotions I was having wasn't necessarily just about the loss of the job, the redundancy, if you like. That process also started to impact on me from way before. And the loss of power, loss of control, was an element in some other areas of my life. So as I'm going through this process of the loss of the job, then my feelings, my emotions were amplified. And because it had this element of loss of control, loss of power, those other things in my life started to come back and started to create really awkward, painful processes for me with relationships in the past and various other bits and pieces. So I kind of realised that when I was going through this reflection process, as we do as counsellors, that the processes weren't just about the end of the job. They were about these other things. At the time, I had no idea that was happening, as you can imagine. But in my subconscious, all these things had been stored. All these feelings and emotions had been stored. So when they started coming out, they were impacting in the present day, but they weren't from the present day. And when we work with loss in the room with clients, then these things can occur. So it's really hard, as I say, to separate those things out. But it's quite interesting in some senses, horrible to go through, obviously. I'm not minimising the effect it has. But it's interesting to try and pull and tease those other aspects. So what we do in the counselling process is we try and look at the elements of it, the feelings, the emotions, the dynamics of it. What is it in that loss that's creating that problem? Now, if I was able to do that when I lost the job, I might have been able to understand those other hidden aspects that were adding to the process. As I was thinking about it later with this training and counselling and process that I've done over the many years we've been counselling, then that aspect means that now I would be able to tease those things out. So I'd look at the dynamic, I'd look at the feelings and emotions that it's given me, not just in its entirety, but kind of tease those things out about anger, loss, power, control, and look at the elements of that feeling. And that sometimes can help us to be more able to cope with it because we're pulling those things apart and we're dealing with the current loss, but we're also separating out and dealing with the other losses. So when you find people reacting in a very massively over the top way sometimes with their emotions and feelings, it's not always about what's going on for them at that point in their life or in the dynamic between the two of you. There's sometimes these other elements that have been stored. Now that can be helpful in our relationship with other people, because if our partners, our relationship connections can understand that we're not mad at them fully, we also have these other feelings and emotions coming on from the past, then it can make it a lot easier to work with. We obviously see in the present their reaction to us quite naturally, and anger, frustration are normal aspects of being a human being. So sometimes we're not able to pull those things apart, dissect them. So when we're doing that in the room, in the counselling room, what we try and do is kind of do a timeline, a kind of chronological order of the emotions, the feelings, the structures that we're working with. So in my case, if you use my example, I would be looking at power or loss of power and control, which would have a feature of rejection, which has a feature of loss. They are all interconnected. When we have those situations and we pull them apart, we kind of create this chronological order of things when these things occurred previously. That then can make it easier for us to deal with it, because we don't deal with the whole thing, we deal with the elements of it, and that usually can help us to reduce the anger, the frustration, the feelings and emotions we're having. And that then can help us to kind of deal with the things that should be dealt with in the order they should be dealt with, which reduces, hopefully, the feelings and emotions in the moment. So the people around you, people that connect to you, the people that love you, care about you, they can see that these things aren't a part of who they are or the things they've done. They can see that it's part of the process. Now you'll find that in a lot of ways, in a lot of situations in life, where we get very angry about very small, insignificant things sometimes. But there is an aspect of loss within change. So even if the change we are going to have, or we structure, or we make happen, there is an element of loss. there is an element of leaving something behind just by the nature of getting something new. So even though what we're changing might be in us a really positive, a really happy process to change, there will be these small elements of loss. And sometimes, even though we're changing things in our world for the better as we see them, we will still have this emotional whirlpool going on. And sometimes that isn't easy. Sometimes that's hard to cope with, because that element of who we are and how we relate and what we do is a big part of human beings' lives. Our relationships, usually, for most people, we want to connect. We want to be a part of something. Now, if you take that process, and if you say, okay, somebody's going through a loss process, say now somebody has died in a family, for example, each individual person will react differently to that, quite naturally. But it's very hard to understand other people's losses, other people's emotions, other people's processes, because we all believe, wrongly unfortunately, that our world is the way that everybody else works their world. This is how it should be. This is what we do. This is what everybody does. Not true. So when we get families that have lost certainly a matriarch or a patriarch, somebody central to the organisation of that family, then sometimes what can happen is those family units can split, can pull apart. They can not necessarily connect. Now that could be about the person that's passed over, the person that's died. But it could also be about these other elements that are working in the background that haven't necessarily been fully explored or processed. So when I say loss is a really difficult and powerful thing, it is. Now, there's two different types of loss. There's a loss that we are in charge of, i.e. we've made a decision to change. And there's a loss that we're not in charge of. In my example, I wasn't in charge of that leaving the job by getting made redundant, by throwing me out, in a sense. So those aspects, if we're not in charge of, we react massively different, as you can imagine. So how the loss is incurred is important to understand as well. So when it's bringing up all these other feelings and emotions, there will be some theme, some connection, some basic emotional disturbance that connects all things together, which you can find if you do the timeline process. Then if you work through that process one at a time, you can sometimes release that and make it easier for us to connect. So if you are going through a family disturbance, a family loss, try to understand that other people may not see it the way you do. They had different relationships with the person, even if in the same family. And their process of loss will be completely different to yours usually. So it's about being kind. It's about being respectful, valuing other people's ideas, processes, changes, alterations. And if you can do that, if you can work that process in that way, it might make it easier to go through, not just for you, but also for other people. So when I went through my loss with the job, then the frustration, anger, unfortunately, went out to other people. Not necessarily helpful, I need to say. But as those other people kind of relate to me, they also relate to other people. And it's a bit like, I use an example of, somebody upsetting you out there in the wide world, and you get on a bus and you have to talk to the bus driver or just basically say hello. Nowadays, just tap a card, don't you, usually? And that bus driver then gets some of that angst, some of that frustration, some of that disturbance, emotional disturbance that you're going through. You might be short with them. I say, oh, hello. You might not talk to them at all. That rippling of that emotion extends to other people. And then the next person that gets on behind you, the driver, might then be short with that person. So it ripples out, and those emotions ripple out to other people. And not necessarily in a good way sometimes. So when people go through these processes, they usually have some element of behaviour that is quite extreme. They may go off and get drunk when they don't get drunk. They may go off and do drugs when they don't do drugs. They may go off and spend an awful lot of money. For me, I had a holiday in America with a family. Made it a bit more palatable at the time. And so those behaviours sometimes extenuate that we would do things, sometimes irresponsible things, in order to process the feelings and emotions we're going through. Because we haven't got power in the process of loss, we try to engage with a process that gives us power. Human beings are really simple, usually, at their heart, the way they work. I don't mean simple in their mind, in the way they work their worlds. But we make it really complicated. So we hide those aspects of ourselves with very intricate patterns of behaviour that it doesn't necessarily make sense. So when we're working with that element of emotional disturbance, emotional loss, emotional processes, we need to kind of find out if there's any other elements in there. We need to try and tease these other things out, because that will help us to be more in control of our emotions, our reactions, our behaviour. But also it'll make it so that we can kind of live with it more. Because the more we disturb other people around us, the more their ripples will come back on us at some point, quite naturally. So if we disturb and upset somebody close to us because we're going through all this process, which is not about them, it's about us, then at some point they may give us that back. Or, like the bus driver, they may give it to the next person that they come across, the next person they see. So when we look at loss, we look at feelings and emotions, and we look at the kind of complexities of them. It can be very hard, as I've said, to tease these elements away from the process that you're going through. But if you can, then you may be able to look at it in a different way. You may be able to work with it differently. It may not upset other people as much, which would be really helpful. So I say that always comes back to haunt you at some point. And it may help you to connect instead of disconnect from people around you. The disconnection is not good. We're not usually okay when we disconnect. We tend to be very culturally connected community kind of processes that we like to be with other people. We like to share time with other people. So if we isolate ourselves through these processes, that sometimes doesn't help in who we are and what we do. As I said, these are very complex issues. They're not easy to understand sometimes, even for us in the counselling room sometimes. But if we can get more of a handle on it, more of an understanding of it, more on what is the dynamic that I'm going through and where those dynamics occur in other areas of my life previously, we might then be able to become more helpful and kind to ourselves as well as other people. So if these things are occurring to you, if these things make sense to you, what I've talked about today, then try and tease those elements before you go through another major emotional disturbance. Try and look at them in their own way before that happens, so that you've not got the major disruption to go from. You've got a sensible, connected, calmer place to have a look at these elements of what may or may not fuel these things. Because in the moment, you probably can't do it, unfortunately. But afterwards, when you sit down and you look at these elements, then teasing them out, making them aware of why you're doing what you're doing, which is the book, then hopefully that will become much more able to be understood, to be worked with, and not give you so much disruption in your world, in your life. Hopefully that's made sense. And thanks for joining me on this small journey around loss, which is a huge topic. And if you think that this might be helpful to somebody else, or even if you don't know it will be helpful to somebody else, please like, share the podcast, because at the end of the day, my world here today with you is to try and make sense of things that don't make sense. My name's Ian Wallace. Take care.